Good afternoon, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on floating collection, how it can work in a large multi-campus academic library. I'm Maria Pincus, a virtual member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I will be your host for this afternoon's webinar. Today's presenters are Barbara Kupi and Barb Eschbach. Barbara Kupi is Associate Librarian, Assistant Head for Access Services, and Head of Interlibrary Loan for Penn State University Libraries. She oversees all aspects of resource sharing activities conducted on multi-systems among Penn State's 38 libraries located across 23 campuses and the Penn State World Campus. In 2009, she received the ALA Virginia Boucher OCLC ILL Distinguished Librarian Award, and in 2012 received the Pennsylvania Library Association Certificate of Merit Award. Barb Eschbach is the head librarian at Penn State, York, and a recent recipient in the Pennsylvania Library Association's Academy of Leadership Studies. Formerly, she was the reference and instruction librarian at the York campus. Now a few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. GoToWebinar does not have interactive chat capabilities, but if you wish to comment during today's session using Twitter, you may use the hashtag you see on the screen. Twitter feeds will not be monitored. If you have any questions for the presenters, please type them at any time into the box entitled Questions. The presenters suggest that you include the slide number with your question if it concerns the content of a specific slide. Questions will be answered as time permits at the end of the presentation. Those which remain unanswered while we are on the air will be answered offline and the responses sent to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded. You should be receiving an email with a link to the recording, the presentation slides, and an evaluation form for the webinar within 2 days. Please take time to fill it out, since it will be useful to the committee for planning future events. Now I leave you with Barb Eschbach, who will be our first speaker for today's presentation.
Thank you, Maria, for the introduction, and thank you to ALCTS for sponsoring this presentation. Barbara Kupi and I will be alternating back and forth throughout this webinar. And we're going to begin with the 3 broad areas that we'll be covering in today's presentation. We'll talk about the steps necessary to implement a floating collection, and we'll do this in terms of an academic library. You may have already realized that most of what you read and hear about floating collections relates to public libraries. So there are some challenges of making this work within a multi-campus environment. But most importantly, we want you to realize the benefits of having a floating collection. We'll need to start with a definition of a floating collection, and we're using one provided by our ILS vendor. A floating collection is a group of items that belong to whichever library has most recently discharged them. Now, we don't want anyone to panic when they hear the word belong. This is one of the examples where the documentation seems more in line with the practice of a public library. From the very beginning, we wanted to retain the original owning library in our staff client. So we had to adapt our ILS to meet the needs of an academic library. So really, our definition would be more like temporarily housed in the library that has most recently discharged them, rather than belonging to that library. A little bit of background about Penn State will be useful. You can see we have over 96,000 students located at 23 campuses, and you can see from the numbers our campuses vary greatly in size. My campus in York has around 1,200 students, And you can see the highest concentration of over 45,000 students is at the main campus in University Park, where Barbara Coopy is located. And you can see our campuses are spread throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, with the University Park main campus located pretty much in the center. Penn State University Libraries have over 6 million volumes, and we currently rank 8th among North American research libraries. And these are two important facts about our libraries in terms of implementing a floating collection. One, all of our library resources and services are offered to Penn State faculty, staff, and students regardless of their campus affiliation or location. And all locations, including our health sciences and law libraries, share a single ILS. Our presentation is structured loosely on this timeline, beginning with the initial question and leading up to the present day. I began working for Penn State University Libraries in the spring of 2009 as the reference and instruction librarian at the York campus. And I spent a lot of time that first summer filling in for staff when they were on vacation. As a result, I found myself spending a lot of time packing up material to send to other campuses, both to fulfill holds and for reshelving. At the time, I mistakenly thought we were actually paying the price I saw printed out on all these labels, and I began to wonder why so much time and money was being spent sending books back just to be reshelved. I wish I could say I was actually wondering more about our patrons and the impact on them of the wasted time or material spent in transit. However, in hindsight, that is really the more important consideration. So I'm going to take you through this example that's on the screen, and this is an example of how it worked prior to implementing a floating collection. So imagine you're a Penn State student from the Harrisburg campus, and you borrowed this book from the York campus. After returning it to Harrisburg, it's put back in transit to York to be reshelved. Now, imagine that the student who borrowed this mentioned to a procrastinating classmate that this book had some really helpful information, and the procrastinating classmate decides to request the book. Well, fortunately, you can still put holds on items when they're in transit, but I want you to think about the time wasted sending this book back and forth. The classmate has to wait for the book to be returned to York, discharged, and then sent back to Harrisburg before he can check it out. With a floating collection, that book would have been available to this procrastinating classmate immediately, as it would have been shelved at the Harrisburg campus rather than being returned to York, saving days of waiting. However, time would be saved even if that procrastinating student was from another campus, as the book would have been immediately available to be sent from Harrisburg to that student's campus to fulfill the hold. With the huge number of books in our system, just think about how many times the same scenario would be played out. Items aren't available when they're in transit. I imagine this is how it works in many of your libraries. Well, with the exception of procrastinating students aren't usually immediately requesting items. That leads me to the first milestone in our timeline. I attended my first campus librarians retreat in November of 2009, and I asked this question, although probably not quite so eloquently. I had been hearing since beginning at Penn State that our libraries were considered one collection, geographically dispersed. So it seemed natural to wonder why we had to send books back just for reshelving. Although as soon as I asked the question, I could tell from some of the reactions it didn't necessarily seem like a good idea to everyone. Fortunately, we had a library administration interested in pursuing the question, so that February a task force was formed. And of course, you know, if you ever ask a question, you get put on the task force. We do want to stress at this point the importance of having a good mix of people on your task force, from campus librarians to do the testing to access service librarians who really understand the technical aspects, such as wizards and policies. While it's extremely beneficial to have people who've been around long enough to truly understand the ILS, I thought that it was also really helpful to have some new people who ask a lot of questions and make others stop and think about why we have to do things in a certain way. So of course our initial original question led to many other questions, and we'll be discussing the answers to these questions throughout the rest of this webinar. Have other libraries tried this? Would it really save staff time and shipping costs? Could our ILS support such a concept? What materials would we want to float? And would a floating collection work for some of our campus libraries and not others?
Benchmarking is valuable. I'm Barbara Coopy, and welcome everybody. Benchmarking is valuable. I know it helped me pull the concept together and think about what may work. We benchmarked other libraries, but we couldn't find any academic libraries that float books. We surveyed our internal stakeholders, like our collection development librarians, Access Services Council, campus librarians, and acquisitions and cataloging. Some thought it was an intriguing idea, and others questioned whether it would work. We analyzed data, but I'll talk about that later. As Barb mentioned, we are a large university. We mainly follow the 2 semesters, but many incoming freshmen start in the summer. The medical school starts in June, law in August, World Campus goes all year long, and we have grads and faculty that are always doing research. So it's hard to find a good slow time for testing. The first thing we wondered was, would a floating collection work within our complex ILS environment across multiple locations with millions of volumes? Another question was, would it work in our ILS that had been customized over the years to meet our unique demands? And what could be some consequences of introducing floating books into this system? Would we end up with major technical or service issues as a result of floating collections? Now the big question and the scare was, what if we made the system crash and it took weeks to get it working again, or never really working the same again? We had some early observations about us versus the libraries we benchmarked. We are a large, complex research library system versus the public library system that we were talking to. Our collection ranges from small campus libraries primarily for undergraduates to subject-specialized libraries meeting the needs of researchers to an overcrowded main library. Librarians at each location develop their collection to meet their local users' needs, but keep in mind the broad use for all users. We found that on the average, most books go in transit from the campus libraries to University Park, which is the larger user base. We saw that we are different from public library systems with floating collections. Our mission to support research and teaching, our collection focus, and our usage patterns. We concluded that we needed to develop our own approach to floating collection. One recommendation we heard from many was to weed aggressively. That was not going to happen. To get a major weeding project across our many locations would take years, so we just scrapped that major recommendation. Another recommendation was to merge our locations into one general stacks location so it would be more understandable to users and staff. To lose the owning or the purchasing library was too overwhelming a concept, so we decided that was not feasible. Now, ignoring 2 major recommendations made us somewhat hesitant that our experiment was going to work. But we moved on. We knew that not everything should float, and of course the major question before us was, how could we introduce a floating collection into the library without disrupting normal activities? To narrow our focus, could we create a subset of floating books for only 4 campus libraries, the 3 on our task force and 1 that was interested in joining us? could we do this within the library's collections and within our ILS? Continuing on this thought, if we could create a subset, could this subset of books function as other books in the system, such as holds, reserves, discharging, yet be recognized as floating and remain in the floating library where it was most recently discharged? For the data we collected, the in-transit data here, it shows holds and what was returning to be shelved, and for reserves, but it was not specific enough. It didn't show format, and we couldn't estimate the number of packages shipped. So each library participating manually counted each shipment daily for 2 months. We counted the books that were returning for shelving. So if York had 1 book for a hold and 1 book for shelving going to Harrisburg, the package was not counted as a possible savings because the package would have needed to be shipped. Our statewide courier service counts packages shipped to estimate next year's fees, so we wanted to count the books returning for shelving. We also estimated the space needed for the floating library based on these figures, and the participating libraries said they had enough space to shelve the additional books. We found that our ILS had a floating collection feature, which limited floating policies to either library and item type. One thing we needed to resolve is each library had many locations for books, like juvenile collection, leisure reading, and general collection. So we had to decide what we wanted to float and fit that in to how the system operates with floating collection. We tested floating in July, August, and September of 2010 on our test server, and it appeared to work. The item library changed whenever the book was discharged at a floating library, but the home location was constant, which is what we wanted because we did not want to lose that original owning library. In testing, we discovered that dormant reserve records prevented floating collection from working properly. We were surprised to see we had thousands of these records. We ran reports, and each library cleaned up their records so the project could continue. Eventually, we did involve all the libraries to clean up their dormant reserve records in the system.
So a year later, we reached another milestone. In our report to our sponsors, and in the presentation given at the annual Campus Librarians Retreat, we recommended trying a pilot program. This was the logo for BookFloat, which was our pilot program. And preparing for a pilot raised a whole new set of questions. Some were easy ones, such as what types of materials did we want to float? But others were more troubling questions, such as what if the library ends up with too many books? However, that second question brings up a good point. Since we were retaining the original ownership information for all our floating material, we weren't doing anything that we couldn't change back. So we could always send books back to the original owning library. The security systems are an example of an issue that we thought might be a potential showstopper. And we actually ran into a number of these issues as we prepared for the pilot, but each one we encountered turned out to be solvable, and usually without much of a problem at all. So we started to refer to BookFloat as the pilot that just wouldn't die. We'll talk more about the last 2 bullet points later in the presentation, but we'd like you to know that these issues, these last 2 issues, were not a result of a floating collection, but rather they were existing problems that were discovered by implementing a floating collection. So simply put, this is what we decided, to limit our pilot to circulating monographs in the general stacks of 4 campus libraries. So now the real work began. Our ILS vendor recommended creating a new item type for floating material rather than editing an existing one. So here's a representation of our staff client prior to our pilot program. You can see this particular title is owned by 2 campuses, Erie, which is also known as the Barron campus, and York. and as to be expected, the item type for both is book. We decided on the new item type of book float for our floating material, and I'll jump ahead in time to show you what the staff client looked like for that title during the pilot. You can see that the item type did not change for Erie, who was not part of the pilot, but it did change to book float for York, who was one of the pilot libraries. Each item type in the staff client has a corresponding description in the public catalog. So here's a representation of this description, which shows as material in the public catalog prior to the pilot. Our new description for the public catalog proved to be a little trickier. For the item type of book float, we chose the corresponding material description book floating for the public catalog. And I need to tell you right away that we never liked this description. We felt it would potentially be confusing for our patrons, so every time I have that phrase up, I show this little ticking time bomb, because we felt that that's really what this issue was. It was a challenge we could temporarily work with during the pilot, but again, it was something that no one liked. Ultimately, this was the only issue that we ever considered serious enough to end the floating collection. So here's a review of the changes we made concerning the item type. And I'll jump ahead again to show you how this looked in the public catalog during the pilot. And you can see why we were worried this description might be confusing to patrons. And we'll talk more about why this was so problematic in a few minutes. However, that floating process itself was not problematic. The act of discharging the book float item type at a participating floating library did not put the item in transit to the original owning library. So it worked, and it was easier than we thought it would be. Now on to the location. Prior to the pilot, you can see we used library-specific locations in our public catalog. And here, we partially followed our ILS vendor recommendation. We changed the location description of our floating items, but we only did that in the public catalog. And we changed them to a consistent generic location, choosing Stack's General Collection. But if you remember, Barbara mentioned earlier that we were going to ignore this recommendation. So we didn't merge our locations in our staff client into one general Stack's location. We only changed the description in our public catalog. Choosing not to change the library-specific location in our staff client is probably a major difference between an academic library and a public library. Because remember, this reflected our desire to retain the original owning library information. And I think this is also a good example of how we adapted the ILS floating collection module to meet our needs as an academic library. So here's a representation of the new location description in the public catalog. And you'll notice the difference between the material and the location for Erie's copy and for York's copy.
Well, our optimistic group came to the conclusion after our investigation that we saw no reason why a book needs to be returned to the original library for shelving. So we went live with a pilot with 4 libraries: Fayette, York, Harrisburg, and Hazleton. They're in red dots on the screen. We set up floating policies on our production server, and even though floating collection worked in the test environment, we wondered if it would work in a live environment. We converted 358,867 records. It's small compared to our overall collection, but it was a good size to work with. We met with Cataloging and Acquisitions to develop their procedure for adding the book float item type to new material. Now, since there were only 4 libraries using this item type for books in their general stacks, sometimes this new item type, book float, was missed by acquisitions. So we periodically ran lists and reports to move items from book to book float. The libraries reviewed the list to decide whether a book should migrate to book float or keep it as a book, and this was a local campus library decision. One warning we heard while benchmarking was that we may need to redistribute the collection. So we prepared for this by creating a way within the system to send books back to the owning library. We placed a hold for the owning campus library departmental user and shipped them. When they discharged them at the other end, they were then shelved and back home. We have 3 interlibrary loan systems that integrate with our ILS. We discovered that to have these systems integrate successfully, we needed to add all of the library location combinations in their system, since the systems looked at both the library, like Harrisburg, and the shelving location, Stacks FE.
So in June 2012, after piloting a floating collection for a little over a year, the task force recommended making it permanent for all campus libraries. And we made this recommendation despite the one issue we still weren't completely satisfied with. You remember I mentioned earlier we would talk about why that new material type in our public catalog was so problematic. Well, in addition to thinking that it looked confusing to patrons, it also necessitated multiple searches in the advanced search for both material types, book and book floating, if patrons wanted to limit their search to just books. So in this respect, a floating collection certainly wasn't seamless to our patrons. And the only reason that we were able to recommend a floating collection be made permanent was because, coincidentally, we had recently implemented a new discovery service. And that discovery service combined the item types book and book floating into one search using the term book. So we started to recommend our patrons use this particular service. But again, coincidentally, around the same time, we were able to work with our ILS vendor to combine material types in the public catalog. So when you look at this screen, even though it looks like it's just one material type of book, that search is actually combining the item types of book, book float, and serial for this search. And this solved the most serious issue we had with a floating collection. So here's a final wrap-up of how the item type evolved in our ILS and how the location evolved. At least it evolved in the public catalog. Again, you see we didn't change the location in the staff client.
So moving along and getting everybody's willing to participate, we now have phase 2 libraries, and we have an additional 6 libraries. And then in phase 3, we have the final 9 libraries that were added. We now have 19 libraries. Not participating are the main libraries, the main library and the subject branches at University Park, the Law Library at Carlisle, the Medical Library at Hershey, and Great Valley, which is in transition and redistributing its collection. So you can see those, they're in white dots, the ones that are not participating.
So now in this example, you can see that the only difference between this and what you saw during the pilot is that now Erie, the Barron campus, is part of book float. So that item type is reflected in this staff client. And you see the material type being the same, and the location is a generic stacks location for both campuses. So we really believe that the majority of the benefits from a floating collection are patron benefits. A floating collection results in a more refreshed collection, and I kind of think this aspect may be more important in a public library where patrons come in and they browse for books trying to find something they haven't already read. But in an academic library, we found that books were ending up where they actually were needed. A huge patron benefit for us, though, is there's no longer this wasted transit time returning books for reshelving, which results in patron holds being filled more quickly. So think back to this example that I gave in the beginning, and hopefully now you can see how a floating collection really does save transit time and what a benefit that is for patrons. And even though I found out through this whole process that we weren't really paying by the weight of each package, we were able to reduce the number of shipments, which is how we're billed by our consortium, which potentially could result in a significant cost savings.
Our floating collection libraries have conference calls periodically to discuss issues or to pose questions. Since it has only been one full semester with floating collection in place, we are still new at this. Some concerns raised recently were shelf space. How much do staff want to shift to accommodate incoming books? Duplication. What do we do with 3 books of the same title? And having new books end up at another library before coming to the purchasing library. Since we have semester loan, it's slow to get any data to analyze. This slide shows a snapshot of the net gain or loss of floating books at some of the floating libraries. In the last column, we see that Abington had a net gain of 82 books on September 5th. Of course, this number is very fluid as books come and go daily. Shipping costs are also slow to analyze, but we did see a reduction so far, especially for the pilot libraries. We found unexpected benefits for the libraries as a whole. We removed thousands of inactive reserve records which did not need to be in the system and also were unknowingly causing issues with acquisitions and cataloging updating some records. We had a cleanup project where we ran lists of library and home location mismatches, meaning the home location was not valid for that library, and had staff at those libraries investigate and resolve. We are pleased with our floating collection. We're pleased it's working. Many times we thought it was not going to work, as Barb had said, and if it did not, it helped to know that we did have a way to send the books back since we retained that owning library in the home location field. I encourage you to give it a try. What do you need to succeed at floating collection? Well, you need an ILS that has a floating module or a feature so the system can recognize and allow a floating book to stay at the current library that discharged it instead of placing it in transit. You need flexible staff willing to try it, resolve problems and issues when they arise, and then documentation for consistent practices. Our website explains our floating collection and has our documentation. We have training bulletins, and we also meet periodically for discussion to make sure everything is okay. Our next steps. Well, that will be about how we can expand. Other material types, other locations. We also want to do more analysis on the collection. Was a book subsequently used at the new campus library? Can floating collection impact decisions about purchasing a duplicate copy since a book can float to where it is needed? Then, of course, our original question on whether we can reduce shipping costs. Thank you. It is time now for some questions.
Hello, this is Maria, your host again. I do not see any questions on the question pane. If anybody wants to go ahead and type some in. Okay, there's one here. Let me see. Now the question is, does book float functionality work with a resource discovery tool, i.e. Primo, or only through your ILS software?
Primo's a discovery service. That's like our Lion search. And yes, that just needs to be, that item type book float needs to be added in the list of items that are searchable in there. So yes, it does, but it takes some setup.
Do all the floating collection locations maintain stacks with LC call numbers A to Z? How do you shelve the floating materials?
Well, during our pilot, we were trying to decide whether we wanted to inner shelve them or like put a section where there were, new to you incoming books. But we found the libraries just prefer to inner shelve the books. And one of the concerns I did mention before is if somebody had just rearrange their shelves and they get a lot with a particular call number, they're questioning how much do I want to shift again. The pilot libraries had a lot of space, so that wasn't an issue. But now that we've involved 19 libraries, we're seeing different comments on that, and we're still new, so we're trying to figure that out. But the call numbers are all the same across the system, so that's not an issue with the call numbers. It's general stacks, so they go into the general stacks area. That's not an issue either, but it is if they just reduce the size of the collection in one, call number area, and now they have to put a lot in. We had that mentioned, but I haven't seen a lot of issues with that yet.
Can you clarify in the public catalog, how does the patron know which building the floating book is located in?
Barb, do you have a slide on that?
I do. I have to go back this way, Carl, I guess, to get to that. I want to take you here to a representation of the record in our public catalog. And so you see, even though the location is listed as a generic location, you can see under holdings the name of the library. So you can see clearly that this book is at Penn State Erie and also at Penn State York. And then once they know what campus it is, then the location is this just generic stacks, which once they get to the library, somebody would help them get to the right place. So there really isn't any trouble finding the building, since all the libraries that are in this, all the 19 libraries that are part of it, only have one library building. So they just have to get to the right place. Obviously, if they're requesting the book, if it's not at their campus, it doesn't matter what library it's coming from. That makes no difference. But it's easily identifiable in the catalog as to which campus currently has the book.
And how is the budget affected? Is the money reallocated based on where the books go?
You know what we found out by retaining the home location, and when we had talked to acquisitions and cataloging, the acquisitions is still tied to the book, that particular book. And even like if we have from a donor, that's still tied to that particular book. It's just that now it may end up at another campus for a while, but it could always come back to that original library. So we thought maybe that would be a problem, because in benchmarking the public libraries, that was a concern of theirs, that they lost the connection for the purchase of the book, and collection development people were even having trouble determining what had been bought and all that. But see, we've left all of that to that original owning library. So there's still a purchasing library like York, and they're making the decision on what to purchase. And if they have a donor that they want to add that little tag in there, they can do that as well. It's just that that York book may reside on Erie's shelf for a while. So that ended up being a lot easier than we thought it was going to be, and I think it was because we retained that home location. So we didn't have to change anything with the funding. The librarians are still in charge of what they want to purchase for their campus. And then we also, and I have to add that one slide I mentioned, that it was a campus local decision, because there are some things that they're saying, I'm purchasing this for a professor and he wants it on our shelves here, and we have ways of doing that. It didn't go into a book float. And the way our system works, we all have standard practices, but we understand the autonomy of the campuses and how they have unique needs. So what we really basically follow are standard practices so the things float, but they have the choice. They still can purchase a book and leave it at their campus. And if they purchase a book and they can float, that's fine too.
All right. Now, did the 19 PSU participating libraries, excuse me, I lost my question here. Okay. Participating libraries have to agree in advance on a single loan period, for example, a semester?
We've had a standard ILS system for years. So all of these libraries are in our ILS system, which has all the same policies. And I think another reason why it was easy for us to do this is because we have the I Want It on these, and people are just used to clicking on the I Want It and having a book from Erie go to York, or a book from York go to Harrisburg. Now the only difference, and I'm not even sure if our users notice that, is that now that book doesn't go back immediately. But if somebody else on another campus wants to click on an I Want It, it will go again, and it will float again somewhere else. So we've always had the standard ILS, same policies. Each campus is involved in that, even the law school and the medical school. So there are no differing loan periods.
I think just to make it clear, because we did mention semester loans in the presentation, that was just coincidental that the semester loan period came into effect during our floating collection discussions. That semester loan had nothing to do with floating collection. It did make our record keeping a little more difficult because we weren't sure if we were seeing a decrease in shipments because things didn't have to be shipped back as often throughout the semester, but the semester loan policy had nothing to do with floating collection.
And we have semester loan, and then we also have that for faculty and graduate students and staff, unlimited renewals. So they can renew that for a couple more semesters unless somebody places a hold on it. So that's why it's hard to get any kind of meaningful stats. It's going to take a long time, since you can have a book go from Erie to York and that person can have it out for, you know, a couple semesters as long as they want.
How do you handle collection inventories? Do you send stuff back at the end of the year?
No, we have a training bulletin that, you know, if you notice, and I'm going to back up here a minute. A premise that we decided was that the owning library is responsible for that book. So if a book arrives at York and pages are being ripped out, or, you know, there's something that needs to be done to it, or then York will send it back to that owning library with a note and say, look, pages are ripped out. So we will always allow that owning library to make a decision about that book. And that's the same way with weeding. So we wanted to retain that ownership because there may be a reason why Erie bought a book and we don't want York to make a decision on that book. All we want is that book to reside at York for the time being until somebody else wants it. So we left that whole management part up to the original owning library. And that helps with buy-in too, because people didn't have to lose a lot of control over their collection. It's just moving around, and if they want it, they could always, you know, place a hold on it and bring it back.
So at the end of a year, we're not sending inventory back to the original owning library. We're keeping it. And this summer, when we did our weeding at York in one of the sections, and I printed a list of what should be on the shelves, I just told the staff who were actually doing the inventory, you'll see additional items on the shelf too that aren't on this list. Those are floating books that have floated to our library. So those weren't considered in our inventory. We didn't weed them. We just made sure they were in good condition. If we found any that were in poor condition, then we would send that back to the original owning library unit using the process that we had in place to do that. putting a note so that they knew we were returning it because it was in poor physical condition, and then it was up to them whether to replace it or not. But this doesn't involve any mass shipment of books at the end of any particular semester. You keep whatever floated to your library until someone else requests it.
And when we're working on different training bulletins within Access Services, we keep in mind about the floating collection. We just had one recently about we really haven't updated our documentation on missing items, and so the question was, well, okay, we have to make sure we have a little section in there on floating books, and so we'll add that little section. But I think it really has helped us overall to say who purchased that campus library has ownership of that. All you're doing is allowing it to reside somewhere else for somebody else to use. And I don't think we would have had the success that we've had with just our stakeholders involved if we didn't have something like that. And at the beginning, that was not what we were thinking was that important. We just, we were seeing that other public libraries just made it generic, and in the back of our minds we're thinking we can't do that. And I'm so happy we did not go in that direction.
Who takes responsibility when a book goes missing from the collection of a holding library that isn't the owner?
Well, we have a process in place that you try to find it, and we have lots of missing books, and there's no pointing fingers. We just now we've added documentation for floating libraries that, okay, it's not on your shelf. We have to go back to where it could have been. We also send out emails. Has anyone seen this book? So you do the tracking and you find where it could possibly have been misplaced. I think we have a pretty good procedure in place on that. Being a large distributed library like we are, we have a lot of those procedures in place, and we have staff members who are responsible for really, doing the whole part of figuring that out.
And I really haven't noticed any increase in the number of emails we get saying, check your shelves, this book is missing. And the one thing I would add is that if it is missing, the decision to replace it would be back to the original owning library.
Mm-hmm.
So that they could look at the records, decide if this needs to be replaced or if there are enough other duplicate copies in the system that it wouldn't need to be replaced. So that decision, again, resides with the original owning library.
And I think that has also been easy because we have always distributed our collection with the I-1. And I mean, we've been doing this for years. And that, again, I'm saying is I don't think this has been that major of a step. It's not that different of an environment now. We always had to look for missing books that went from Erie to York.
Is book float unmediated? Patron initiates order and it is automatically processed? Or does staff review requests based on guidelines?
It's unmediated. A user can place a hold on any book within the system. And with the floating collection feature within our ILS, the only distinction now is that if it ends up at a floating library, it will stay on their shelf. So if a University Park user places an I wanted for a book at Erie, even though that's a book float item type, since the person returns it to University Park, it will go back to the last floating library, which may have been Erie. So it's all within the system, just like our holds, and we don't have to do any kind of mediation. It's all through system policies.
This attendee is apologizing in case you already touched this, but wants to know if all these cross-circulating libraries have general collections, if none of them are specialized subject libraries, right?
Correct. Our subject libraries at University Park This is where we've stopped because, you know, we basically said we're going to try this, see if it works, see if it, you know, breaks the system, and then we added more. And then for the phase 2, you see we're very cautious at this. And then we added more on phase 3, but they're all the general, primarily undergraduate campuses across the state. Now the next step is, can we add other different locations? And I don't even mean just libraries. I mean just like, remember before I showed you juvenile collection, and there were different kinds of collections just even in each of those libraries. We can see if we want to expand that. Do we want to expand into formats, because we just stuck with the monographs? And then the question has come with the subject libraries, do they want a lot of, you know, current literature? Does our physical mathematical sciences want to add something from the P's? So that's where we're stuck now. And then in the main library here at University Park, we're thinking maybe just sections of it, or I don't know, because we don't have any room at the University Park main library. So that's where, you know, we have more discussions. We did, which we thought was the easy part. And as I mentioned before, is each campus library still can make a decision as to whether they wanted that book to be book float in their general collection. If they have something specific to that library, we made a different location so it does not float. It could be holdable across the system, but it will always return to that campus library.
Is there a plan for the main library to participate in this sooner or later? And if not, why not?
Well, we're still working on reasons on how it can work. So we have no space, so maybe there's a way to pull out little parts of it, or I don't know. We're still new to this. I mean, we just had one semester of all the campus libraries working, and that's where in the next steps is, you know, we have to discuss more.
And I think the concern with the main campus library is mostly the space issue. And they are borrowing more books from other campuses, I think, than they're sending out sometimes. So they would end up with some space problems that we haven't figured out how to address.
And that was one of our original initial discoveries, is that most of the books are in transit to University Park because we have a larger user base. So we would be draining a lot from the campuses.
How has this influenced selection decisions by individual libraries?
I think it can. We do have, you know, we want to reduce duplication, and I think an analysis of that to see if do we really need to have more than you know, one all the time, or, you know, can we reduce some of that duplication because a book can end up in a library that it is used more. And we have a collection development person on our committee, and we, you know, we're looking for him to try to pull out, and he has done a little bit. Barb, could you remember what Nani? I'm drawing a blank now, but I know he's looked at that.
And he is one person on our committee who at the last meeting we had last month said, you know, I am a real convert. I wasn't sure I liked this idea at the beginning, but I really like it now. And I think because we're using campuses where it's a lot of focus on undergraduates, that we do have a lot of common areas that we would be collecting in anyway. So when we make a decision based on what we think our students need, obviously our students are Penn State students, and they might need this no matter what campus they physically were located. So to me, I think it really helps in terms of collection development to think about Penn State University Libraries being one collection, geographically dispersed, and that when we're purchasing things, we're purchasing them for Penn State students no matter where they're located. So it seems to be working fine that way, and I think When you get into the subject-specific libraries, it may be a lot different in terms of collection development, but in terms of the campus, it's working fine.
Okay, so we're at the end of our questions now. It doesn't mean that if anybody else is typing one in or has another one and wants to write it in, they just please go ahead and do so. If we can't answer now, we'll be answering offline and sending the answers with the rest of the information on the webinar. I do have one more that came in. I think we may have time for it. It says, do your libraries have shared access to ebooks? Would you ever consider substituting an ebook for duplicate paper copies that are moving around a lot?
Yes. First off, that all of our licensing is done across all of our campus locations. And secondly, the collection focus now is purchasing an ebook, if possible, for either a duplicate or other kind of material, because it is easier to share the e-resources that way. Yes, so we do.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Barb and Barbara, for a very interesting webinar, and the question and answer session was very interesting too. Our thanks go as well to each of you attending this webinar today. If you have an idea for a webinar, feel free to submit a proposal using the online form found on the ALCTS website. ALCTS offers an array of online learning opportunities. On the screen, you can see the upcoming ALCTS webinars. ALCTS also offers popular web courses for 4 weeks duration. Several of the upcoming ones are sold out. So I have just put in the 2 that still have limited space available. The next MOOCs webinar is on October 9th. You can register for these webinars individually or as a series. The Continuing Education Committee also schedules e-forums free of charge on a monthly basis. ALCTS members as well as non-members are welcome to participate. Please visit the ALCTS website for details about all our continuing education offerings. You see the URL for the website up there. You will get it with your slides. Please visit as we conclude this afternoon's broadcast, I would like to thank Carl Hess and Kat Balick, members of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee's Technical Support Subcommittee, as well as Julie Reese and Vicki Gruzinski in the ALCTS office for their assistance. We hope that this webinar has been of interest to you and look forward to welcoming you at another ALCTS webinar in the future. Good afternoon.